"Hey, easy there," the towering man said, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowded training hall. "You sure you're in the right place, kid?" The room smelled of sweat and varnished wood, the floor worn smooth by years of footwork and discipline. Dozens of spectators ringed the mat, some curious, others openly amused. In the center stood a man who barely reached the giant's shoulder, lean, quiet, and composed. He looked like he could disappear into the background if he wanted to, but he didn't. He stood his ground. "I'm exactly where I need to be," the smaller man replied, his tone calm, almost gentle. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Someone whispered, "This won't last 10 seconds." Another shook his head, already turning away, as if the outcome were decided. The giant rolled his shoulders, muscles shifting beneath his sleeveless shirt. "Look," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound almost kind. "You don't have to prove anything. Walk away now. No one will blame you." The smaller man met his gaze. There was no anger there, no fear either, just a stillness that felt out of place in a room buzzing with expectation. "Sometimes," he said, "walking away is an easy choice." A hush fell. The giant frowned, unsure why those simple words unsettled him. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The referee stepped forward, glancing between them. "You both ready?" The giant nodded with a smirk. The smaller man gave a slight bow. And in that suspended moment, before the first movement, before pride collided with humility, the question hung in the air like a held breath. What happens when strength meets something it doesn't understand? The training hall sat on the edge of the city, tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat that never seemed to close. Inside, the world felt different, measured in discipline instead of noise, in breath instead of bravado. People came here to test themselves, to grow, or sometimes to prove something they couldn't put into words. On that afternoon, the crowd had gathered for a reason that had spread through whispered conversations and text messages. A visiting strongman had issued an open challenge. He was known locally for crushing opponents with sheer size and aggression. 6'5", over 260 pounds, with a reputation built more on intimidation than technique. His name was Carl Brenner, though most simply called him the Wall. Carl thrived on attention. He played the crowd, flexing his arms, grinning as phones came out to record. He wasn't a villain in his own mind. He believed he was giving people a show, a chance to witness dominance in its rawest form. Anyone else? He called out after dispatching his third opponent of the day, a college wrestler who had lasted less than a minute. That was when the smaller man stepped forward. He wore plain black training pants and a white T-shirt, unmarked, unassuming. His build was compact, around 140 pounds, with the kind of lean muscle that suggested function over form. He didn't introduce himself. He simply bowed toward the mat. The room reacted with disbelief. "Is he serious?" Someone murmured. Carl laughed. "This is a gym, not a comedy club." But the smaller man didn't respond. He waited. The gym owner, an older man named Pete, watched from the sidelines. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know that appearances lied. Something about the newcomer's posture, balance, relaxed, alert, caught his attention. Carl stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Kid, I don't want to hurt you." The smaller man's reply was almost a whisper. "Then don't." The words lingered, not defiant, not pleading, simply true. Pete felt a prickle along his arms. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen fear. But this was neither. Carl shook his head, amused. "All right," he said, turning to the referee. "Let's get this over with." No one in the room yet realized they were about to witness a moment that would outlast the laughter. Carl had built his reputation the hard way. Or so he told himself. Years of manual labor, hauling steel and concrete, had forged his body into something that demanded attention. Fighting, for him, was an extension of survival. Push harder. Hit first. Never let them see hesitation. He had learned early that size could end arguments before they began. But size had also isolated him. People deferred to him, avoided him, or challenged him out of ego. Very few spoke to him, as if he were simply a man. As he circled the mat, watching the smaller opponent bow again, Carl felt the familiar surge of control. This would be quick. It always was. Last chance, Carl muttered. The smaller man looked up, eyes steady. You're not my opponent, he said quietly. Your fear is. Carl blinked. What? But the referee had already signaled the start. Carl lunged forward, intending to end the match in seconds. His strategy was simple. Overwhelm, pin, finish. He had done it dozens of times. Yet the moment he closed the distance, something strange happened. The smaller man wasn't where he expected him to be. Not gone, just not there. A shift of weight, a pivot, a blur control movement that felt less like evasion and more like absence. Carl's momentum carried him forward into empty space, his balance faltering. A murmur rose from the crowd. Carl recovered quickly, irritation flaring. Stop dancing, he snapped. Fight! The smaller man tilted his head slightly. I am. Carl attacked again, faster this time, his movements fueled by annoyance. But each strike midair, each grab slipped away as if he were trying to catch water. It wasn't flashy. There were no acrobatics, just economy, precision, calm. Carl felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Not exhaustion, uncertainty. Pete leaned forward from the sidelines, his eyes narrowing. He had seen skilled fighters before, boxers, wrestlers, martial artists from different disciplines. But this was something else. The smaller man moved, as if he were listening to a rhythm no one else could hear. Carl, meanwhile, was losing the crowd. At first they had cheered his aggression. Now they watched in puzzled silence. The giant strikes looked heavy, committed, but also predictable. The smaller man didn't block them. He dissolved around them. Carl swung again, aiming to corner him against the edge of the mat. This time he felt contact, his hand brushing fabric. But in the next instant his wrist was gently redirected, his own momentum spinning him half a step off balance. No pain, no force, just control. Stand still. Carl barked, frustration creeping into his voice. The smaller man met his eyes. Why? The question landed harder than any blow. Carl charged, abandoning restraint. He would crush this calm, this composure that made him feel exposed. But as he lunged, his foot slid slightly on the polished floor. In that instant of imbalance, a light touch at his shoulder guided his momentum downward. He hit the mat, not slammed, not thrown, simply guided there. The room went silent. Carl stared at the ceiling, stunned. No one had ever put him on his back so effortlessly. The smaller man stepped away immediately, offering a hand without triumph. Carl hesitated. Pride burned in his chest. He slapped the hand away and surged back to his feet. Again, he growled. The smaller man bowed. And for the first time in years, Carl felt the ground beneath his confidence begin to shift. The second exchange lasted longer, but the pattern remained. Carl attacked with strength. The smaller man responded with timing. Where Carl pushed, he yielded. Where Carl reached, he was already elsewhere. It wasn't humiliation. That might have been easier to endure. It was something more unsettling, irrelevance. Carl's greatest asset, his size, seemed to matter less with each passing second. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from exertion alone, but from the dawning realization that he did not understand what was happening. Who are you? Carl demanded, circling cautiously now. A student, the smaller man replied. Of what? Of movement, of restraint, of myself. Carl scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. You talk like a philosopher. The smaller man's lips curved faintly. Strength without understanding is fragile. The crowd leaned closer. Phones remained raised, but no one spoke. The energy in the room had shifted from spectacle to witness. Carl attacked again, slower this time, probing. He grabbed the smaller man's arm and felt it slip away like a shadow. A gentle pressure at his elbow turned his own force inward. He stumbled, catching himself before falling. The smaller man stepped back, hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't pressing the advantage. He wasn't even breathing hard. Carl's chest heaved. Anger flared, at the man, at the crowd, at himself. Stop holding back, he shouted. The smaller man's expression softened. I'm not here to defeat you. Then what are you here for? A pause, the kind that forces reflection. To show you, he said, that you don't have to fight the way you've been fighting. Carl froze. No one had ever offered him an alternative. And for the first time, the idea that this encounter might not be about winning or losing began to take root. Carl had spent his life believing that force was the only language people understood. Growing up in a neighborhood where weakness invited trouble, he had learned to make himself large, loud, and unapproachable. It kept him safe. It kept others at a distance. It gave him control. But standing across from this calm, unyielding presence, he felt that control slipping through his fingers. The smaller man waited, neither advancing nor retreating. The crowd silence pressed in, amplifying every breath, every shift of weight. "Why won't you fight me?" Carl asked, his voice lower now. "I am fighting," the smaller man replied. "Just not you." Carl frowned. "Then what?" "Your expectations, your anger, the story you tell yourself about what strength looks like." The words struck deeper than Carl wanted to admit. He attacked again, not out of strategy, but out of discomfort. He needed motion, impact, something familiar. This time, he managed to grab the smaller man's shoulder. For a brief, triumphant moment, he felt contact, solid, real. But in the next instant, the grip dissolved. A subtle shift of hips, a turn of the torso, and Carl found his own arm extended awkwardly, his balance compromised. He released instinctively, stepping back. No counterattack followed. No punishment, only space. Carl realized, with growing unease, that the smaller man could have struck him multiple times by now. He could have embarrassed him. Instead, he chose restraint. "Why?" Carl demanded. The answer came softly. "Because pain teaches quickly, but understanding lasts." Carl swallowed. The crowd was no longer watching a fight. They were watching a lesson, one he had never asked for, yet could not ignore. Pete moved closer to the edge of the mat, his heart thudding. He had seen fighters humble before, but never with such quiet precision. This wasn't domination. It was revelation. Carl's attack slowed, his movements more cautious. He circled, studying the smaller man as if seeing him for the first time. The laughter from earlier felt distant, almost shameful. "What's your name?" Carl asked. The smaller man hesitated, as if the question itself carried weight. "Lee," he said simply. The name meant nothing to most in the room. Just another syllable in a city full of strangers. Carl nodded, breathing hard. "All right, Lee. Show me." Lee tilted his head. "Show you what?" "How you keep doing that." Lee's gaze softened. "You're asking the wrong question." Carl's frustration flickered. "Then what's the right one?" Lee stepped forward, not to attack, but to close the distance. His voice dropped so only Carl could hear. "Why do you need to win?" The question hit harder than any throw. Carl opened his mouth, then closed it. Images flashed through his mind. Schoolyard fights, construction sites, nights when being the biggest man in the room was the only thing that kept trouble away. "I don't," he muttered, though the words fell hollow. Lee stepped back, giving him space again. "Then stop fighting like you do." Carl stood there, caught between habit and possibility. The referee glanced at Pete, uncertain whether to continue. Pete gave a slight nod. Something important was unfolding, something no stopwatch could measure. Carl raised his hands again, but this time there was hesitation in them, not weakness. Choice. The next exchange was different. Carl moved forward, but without the explosive aggression that had defined him. He reached, testing distance rather than trying to overwhelm. Lee responded in kind, guiding, redirecting, never forcing. For the first time, Carl felt the mechanics of his own body, how his weight shifted, how tension slowed him, how anticipation made him clumsy. Lee's touch was light but instructive, like a teacher adjusting a student's posture. Carl stumbled once more, but this time he didn't fall. He corrected, breathing through the motion. "Better," Lee said quietly. Carl blinked. "You're coaching me?" "I'm showing you options," Lee replied. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. This was no longer spectacle. It was transformation in real time. Carl attempted a control grab. Lee pivoted. Guiding the motion into a harmless arc, Carl felt the efficiency of it. The wave force could be redirected instead of resisted. A strange sensation rose in his chest. Relief. He laughed once, a short, incredulous sound. All this time, he said, I thought power meant pushing harder. Lee's expression was calm. Power is knowing when not to. Carl lowered his hands, slightly, absorbing the words. Around them, the gym felt quieter than it had all day. For years, Carl had measured himself against others, bigger, stronger, tougher. Now, for the first time, he was measuring himself against who he had been moments before, and he realized he preferred this version. Carl stepped back, lowering his hands completely. The gesture drew murmurs from the crowd, who expected another clash, another dramatic finish. Instead, they saw a giant standing still, breathing, thinking. I've been fighting wrong, Carl said, his voice carrying across the silent room. Lee watched him, saying nothing. Carl looked at his own hands. Calloused, scarred, tools of both labor and conflict. All my life, he continued, I thought if I stopped pushing, I'd get crushed. That if I wasn't the strongest, I'd be nothing. The admission hung heavy in the air. Lee stepped forward, close enough that Carl could see the steadiness in his eyes. Strength isn't what you do to others, he said. It's what you refuse to do. Carl swallowed hard. The crowd, once hungry for spectacle, now witnessed something far more intimate. A man confronting the story he had built around himself. He extended his hand, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement. Teach me, he said. The word seemed to surprise even him. Lee looked at the offered hand, then at Carl's face. There was no mockery there now, no bravado, only sincerity, raw and unguarded. Lee took the hand. In that moment, the match ended, not with a victor declared, but with a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of the gym. The room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for the entire encounter. Some lowered their phones, unsure whether they had captured a fight or something far more meaningful. Pete wiped his eyes discreetly, pretending to adjust his glasses. Carl stepped off the mat beside Lee, the difference in their sizes no longer the focal point. Instead, it was the space between them, no longer adversarial but collaborative. Where did you learn? Carl asked quietly. Lee shrugged. Everywhere. From teachers. From mistakes. From listening. Carl nodded slowly. Listening was not a skill he had cultivated. He had spent years filling silence with noise, mistaking volume for authority. A young man from the crowd approached hesitantly. Mr. Brenner, he said, I've never seen you stop like that. Carl met his gaze. Neither have I. The admission carried no shame, only truth. Lee gathered his bag from the corner, preparing to leave as quietly as he had arrived. Carl noticed and felt a flicker of urgency. Wait, he said. Will you come back? Lee paused. If you're willing to keep learning. Carl nodded. I am. The simplicity of the exchange belied its significance. For the first time in years, Carl wasn't seeking an opponent. He was seeking growth. As Lee stepped toward the door, the crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear but respect. Someone whispered, Who was that? Pete answered softly, as if the name itself carried weight. That, he said, was a man who understands what strength really is. Carl returned to the gym the next morning before sunrise. The city was still half asleep, the streets quiet except for the distant hum of early traffic. He stood outside the locked doors, hands in his pockets, unsure whether Lee would come back or whether he even deserved the chance. When Pete arrived, he raised an eyebrow. You're early, Carl shrugged. Figure I've got a lot to unlearn. Pete unlocked the door and gestured him inside. That's harder than learning, he said. They trained in silence at first. Carl practiced footwork, feeling awkward without the familiar crutch of brute force. He stumbled, corrected, tried again. Each mistake felt like progress. An hour later, the door creaked open. Lee stepped in, nodding and greeting. No fanfare, no announcement. Carl straightened, a mixture of gratitude and nervousness tightening his chest. You came. Lee set his bag down. You showed up first. Training began without ceremony. Lee guided Carl through simple movements, balance, breathing, alignment. There were no dramatic throws, no crowd to impress. Only repetition and awareness. Carl realized how much tension he carried in his shoulders, how often he anticipated conflict, even in neutral space. Lee's corrections were gentle but precise. "Relax here," he said, touching Carl's forearm. "You're fighting ghosts." Carl exhaled, the phrase resonating more deeply than he expected. By the time sunlight filtered through the high windows, Carl was drenched in sweat. But for once, exhaustion felt clean, unburdened by anger. He wasn't becoming smaller. He was becoming whole. Weeks passed, and the gym's atmosphere shifted. The open challenges stopped. In their place came structured sessions where beginners and veterans trained side by side. Carl, once the center of spectacle, now spent his time helping newcomers find their footing. He corrected stances, encouraged patience, and, most importantly, listened. One evening, a teenager named Marcus hesitated at the edge of the mat, eyes darting nervously. He was slight, unsure, the kind of kid Carl might have ignored in the past. "You joining us?" Carl asked. Marcus shrugged. "I don't want to get hurt." Carl nodded. "Neither do we." The boy looked unconvinced. Carl gestured toward Lee, who was demonstrating a slow, controlled movement with another student. "Strength isn't about hurting people," Carl said. "It's about making sure you don't have to." Marcus stepped onto the mat. Watching the exchange, Pete felt a quiet pride. The gym had become something more than a place to test dominance. It was now a space for growth, humility, and shared learning. Lee remained as unobtrusive as ever, offering guidance when needed, stepping back when not. He never claimed credit for the change. He simply embodied it. Carl realized that influence didn't require volume. It required consistency. And for the first time, people approached him not with fear or bravado, but with trust. Not everyone welcomed the change. One afternoon, a visiting fighter scoffed at the cooperative atmosphere. "This place gone soft?" he sneered, watching a pair of students practice controlled drills. Carl felt the old reflex stir, the urge to prove, to dominate, to silence criticism with force. He inhaled, recognizing the familiar heat of pride. Lee's voice echoed in his memory. "Strength is what you refuse to do." Carl stepped forward calmly. "We're not soft," he said. "We're intentional." The visitor laughed. "Looks like feared me." Carl met his gaze. "Fear makes you loud. Confidence lets you listen." The man hesitated, thrown off by the absence of hostility. Without a spectacle to feed on, his bravado faltered. He muttered something under his breath and left. The students watched Carl, absorbing the lesson more clearly than any demonstration could convey. Later, Marcus approached him. "Weren't you mad?" Carl considered the question. "I used to think anger made me strong," he said. "Turns out, it just made me predictable." Marcus nodded slowly, the insight settling in. Carl realized that the greatest victories left no bruises, only understanding. Months after their first encounter, the gym hosted a community open house. Families filled the space, children weaving between mats, parents watching demonstrations that emphasized control and cooperation rather than competition. Carl stood near the entrance, greeting visitors. A little girl tugged at his sleeve. "Are you the giant?" she asked, eyes wide. He chuckled. "I used to be." She tilted her head. "What are you now?" Carl glanced across the room at Lee, who was helping Marcus guide a younger student through a basic stance. He felt a warmth in his chest. "Now," he said, "I'm a student." The girl smiled, satisfied, and ran back to her parents. Pete approached, folding his arms. "You've changed this place," he said. Carl shook his head. "We did." Pete followed his gaze to Lee. "Funny," he said. "He never tried to." Carl nodded. He didn't have to. The open house ended with a simple demonstration. Carl and Lee moving together in a slow, fluid exchange that resembled a conversation more than a fight. The audience watched in silence, captivated not by violence, but by harmony. For many, it was their first glimpse of strength without aggression. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the emptying gym, Carl and Lee sat on the edge of the mat. The day's noise had faded, leaving only the faint hum of the city outside. "I never asked," Carl said. "Why did you step forward that day?" Lee considered the question. "Because I saw myself," he said, "years ago, angry, certain that force was the only answer." Carl absorbed the admission. What changed? Someone showed me another way, Lee replied. Not by defeating me, by refusing to. Carl nodded, understanding settling into his bones. I'm glad you didn't hurt me, he said. Lee's faint smile returned. You would have learned faster, but you might not have listened. They sat in companionable silence, the kind that requires no filling. Carl realized that the regret he had felt that first day, the sting of being outmatched, had transformed into gratitude. Without that moment, he might never have questioned the story he lived by, and without questioning, he would never have changed. Years later, people still told the story, though it had evolved in the telling. Some exaggerated the size difference. Others claimed dramatic throws that never happened. But those who had been there remembered the truth. The moment a giant stopped fighting and started listening, Carl no longer answered to the wall. He ran the gym alongside Pete, mentoring anyone willing to learn. Marcus had grown into a confident young instructor. The little girl who had asked about the giant now practiced drills with quiet determination. Lee came and went, never staying long, never seeking recognition. His influence lingered not in trophies or titles, but in the way people moved, carefully, intentionally, with respect. One evening, Carl stood at the doorway, watching students train. He caught his reflection in the glass, still large, still imposing, but no longer defined by it. He thought back to the day he had laughed at a 140-pound stranger. Regret had come quickly. Understanding had taken longer, but it had been worth every step. Strength, he had learned, was not about making others smaller. It was about making space for growth, for humility, for change. He turned off the lights and locked the door, the echo of quiet laughter and steady footwork lingering in the air. From which part of the country are you watching the story?